As I walked out, flanked by James and with Doug following at a distance, I overheard Barbara hissing to Doug, "I want him gone from here, whatever it takes." I couldn't help smiling as I left the building. That was exactly what I needed them to say. And the hidden recording device in my jacket pocket had captured every word. The pieces were falling into place, and Barbara had just handed me the evidence of malicious intent that would strengthen my case immeasurably. Now it was time to spring the trap. Over the next week, I prepared my legal counterattack with James's help, organizing all evidence chronologically and building an airtight case against both the HOA and Barbara personally. We documented every illegal entry, every fabricated violation, and every procedural violation in HOA governance. I added multiple security cameras inside and outside my cabin, ensuring no angle was uncovered. James drafted a comprehensive lawsuit alleging harassment, invasion of privacy, defamation, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraud. We were just finalizing the paperwork when I received an urgent call from a neighbor whose identity I had promised to protect. "They had a secret meeting tonight at Barbara's house," my source whispered. I couldn't hear everything, but they were discussing some kind of environmental emergency inspection of your property, something about hazardous materials. "They're planning to force you out within the next 48 hours. After thanking my informant, I called James, who advised me to secure anything valuable or sensitive immediately. "This sounds like they're planning to plant evidence," he warned. "They're getting desperate." I spent the evening moving important documents and valuables to a safe deposit box in town, then returned home and waited, cameras recording continuously. Around midnight, headlights swept across my windows as several vehicles pulled into my driveway. I quickly activated the live streaming backup for all my security cameras, sending the feed to James's secure server. Then I slipped into bed, pretending to be asleep. Minutes later, the pounding began, violent, authoritative, designed to intimidate. I grabbed my phone and started recording as I approached the door in my pajamas. Outside stood Doug, 4 security officers, and a man in a cheap hazmat suit holding what looked like testing equipment. Doug thrust a document at me. "In Valley HOA Emergency Hazardous Materials Inspection," he announced, pushing his way in before I could fully read the paper. "We have reports of potentially toxic substances being stored on the premises." I examined the document. It was clearly a forgery signed by Doug himself, with no legal authority under Colorado state law. "This is an illegal document," I stated firmly. "You have no authority to enter my home. I want all of you to leave immediately." The man in the hazmat suit pushed past me, followed by the others. "We don't need your permission," Doug smirked. "This is an environmental emergency affecting the whole community." What followed was a deliberate ransacking of my home under the guise of an inspection. They opened cabinets, pulled out drawers, and even slashed my couch cushions looking for evidence. The hazmat-suited man took samples from my kitchen cleaners, laundry detergent, and workshop supplies, labeling everything with ominous-looking tags. When I attempted to stop them from entering my home office, 2 of Doug's men physically restrained me while the others rifled through my files. Throughout the ordeal, I kept my phone recording, documenting every violation, every face, every action. After nearly an hour, the hazmat technician approached Doug with a grave expression. "I've detected concerning levels of potentially harmful substances," he announced theatrically. "Specifically in these household products." He was holding standard cleaning supplies found in any home. Doug turned to me with poorly concealed satisfaction. "Mr. Davis, based on this inspection, you are hereby ordered to vacate these premises within 24 hours for emergency decontamination. Failure to comply will result in a $20,000 fine and forced removal." I maintained my composure despite my racing heart. "You have no legal right to order this, and everything you're doing is being recorded and transmitted to my attorney." Doug's expression hardened. "I don't care what you're recording, this is HOA territory and we are the law here." After they finally left, having deliberately left my home in shambles, I immediately called the real police to report a breaking and entering. The responding officers, different from my previous encounter, took statements, but ultimately concluded they couldn't intervene in what they considered an HOA enforcement action. Even though they broke into my home without legal authority, I asked incredulously. The officer shrugged. "Take it up with your HOA board, sir, or get a lawyer." That night, I sat alone amid the wreckage of my cabin. Furniture upended, door frames splintered where they had forced entry, possessions strewn everywhere. I had never felt so violated, so powerless. It wasn't fear I felt, but a profound disillusionment with the system I had believed would protect me. I had spent my career upholding the law, believing in its fundamental fairness. Now I was experiencing firsthand how easily it could be perverted by those with even a small amount of power. My eyes fell on an old family photo from Chicago, now lying on the floor, its frame cracked, a reminder of why I had left the city seeking peace. As I picked up the damaged frame, something crystallized within me, a new resolve that went beyond anger or revenge. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who had been bullied into submission by petty tyrants hiding behind official-sounding titles. Just as I began cleaning up the mess, my phone pinged with a text from an unknown number. "I have information about Barbara you need to know. Meet me at the coffee shop outside Pine Valley 7 a.m. tomorrow." I didn't recognize the number, but I knew this could be the final piece I needed. As I continued picking up the wreckage of my belongings, I began formulating my endgame, a counter-strike that would ensure Barbara Thompson and her HOA would never recover. At 6:45 the next morning, I was already seated at a corner table in Mountainside Coffee, the small cafe located just outside Pine Valley's boundaries. I had arrived early to scope out the place, half expecting this to be a trap. The shop was nearly empty, just a few commuters grabbing coffee before heading to work in the city. At precisely 7, a nervous-looking woman in her early 30s entered, scanning the room before spotting me. She approached cautiously, clutching a manila envelope to her chest like a shield. "Are you Michael Davis?" she asked in a hushed tone, sliding into the seat opposite me without waiting for a response. She introduced herself as Emma Foster, Barbara's former executive assistant at the HOA, who had been fired 6 months ago. She claimed I made accounting errors, but the truth is, I asked too many questions about where the money was going. Emma explained, her hands shaking slightly as she pushed the envelope across the table. "I've been keeping these documents as insurance. When I heard what they did to your place last night, and it's all over the community message boards, by the way, I knew it was time to come forward." Inside the envelope was a gold mine of evidence. Bank statements showing Barbara had been embezzling from the HOA reserve fund for years, using the money for personal expenses, including a $300,000 swimming pool at her private residence. Emails between Barbara and Doug, discussing their relationship and how to use HOA funds to pay for Doug's security services. And most damaging of all, a detailed spreadsheet documenting which homeowners Barbara considered problems, and the strategies she planned to remove them from the community. My name was at the top of the current list with the notation "attorney requires special handling, use environmental pretext for forced removal." Emma revealed that Barbara and Doug's relationship went beyond professional. They had been having an affair for years with Doug's security consultancy serving as a cover to funnel HOA money to him. "Barbara's terrified of aging and losing her influence," Emma confided. "Doug makes her feel powerful and protected. Together they've been ruling Pine Valley like their personal thief." Emma also confirmed my suspicion that the hazardous materials expert from the raid was actually Doug's nephew who worked at an auto parts store, not a qualified environmental inspector. With this new evidence, James and I finalized our lawsuit, adding charges of embezzlement, conspiracy, and fraud to the already substantial list. I contacted Susan, the journalist, and shared the complete story with her, including Emma's documents. She was stunned by the scope of corruption in what had appeared to be an ordinary suburban HOA. "This is going to be bigger than my original story," she said, already thinking of headlines. "People across the country deal with HOA overreach, but this is criminal activity hiding behind community rules." Melissa organized a secret meeting of affected homeowners at her house, carefully screening attendees to ensure no Barbara loyalists infiltrated our group. Nearly 20 residents showed up, each with their own story of harassment, unfair fines, and intimidation. I presented our evidence and legal strategy, proposing that we all file individual lawsuits on the same day to overwhelm Barbara's resources. "The HOA has insurance, but it won't cover deliberate fraud or criminal acts," I explained. "Barbara and Doug will be personally liable for their actions." The energy in the room shifted from defeated resignation to cautious hope as people realized they weren't alone in their struggles. We agreed to move forward with our coordinated legal action in 3 days, giving everyone time to gather their personal documentation. As the meeting concluded, one of Melissa's neighbors rushed in breathless with urgent news. "Barbara knows about the meeting," she gasped. Someone told her, and she's threatening to find anyone involved with unauthorized gatherings in violation of HOA rules. Before we could fully process this, my phone rang. It was my security system alerting me to motion at my cabin. I pulled up the live feed to see Barbara, Doug, and 2 security officers posting large notices on my door and windows. Zooming in, I could read the text promising unadministered by order of Pine Valley Home and Venter County Highway, and they were placing yellow caution tape across my porch and doorways. This is their nuclear option, I told the group grimly. They're trying to lock me out before we can file the lawsuits. Within minutes, several of us were in cars heading back to my cabin. We arrived to find Doug supervising the security team as they attempted to change my locks. When Barbara spotted me approaching with witnesses, her composure briefly cracked. "You're in violation of a hazardous materials evacuation order," she shouted, her voice higher than usual. "This property has been condemned pending decontamination." Doug stepped forward, hand resting meaningfully on the retired police badge he still wore. "Don't make this difficult. Davis, we have the authority to secure contaminated properties." I remained calm, phone recording everything. "What you have is a fraudulent document with no legal standing, and you're currently committing breaking and entering, vandalism, and criminal trespass." I turned to address the neighbors who had gathered to watch the confrontation. "Everything you're witnessing is being recorded. Barbara Thompson and Doug Wilson are attempting to illegally seize my property based on fabricated environmental concerns." Their expert was Doug's nephew who works at AutoZone. Barbara's face contorted with rage. "This is a private HOA matter. Everyone needs to disperse immediately or face fines for interfering with official HOA business." But the crowd was growing with more residents emerging from nearby homes. Phones out recording the scene. I seized the moment to address everyone present. For years Barbara has used the HOA to harass homeowners, fabricate violations, and even embezzle your dues. I have the financial records, proving she's stolen nearly $1 million from our community funds. I hadn't planned on the dramatic confrontation, but seeing the community finally bearing witness to Barbara's tactics presented the perfect opportunity. I continued documenting everything while sending the video feed to Melissa, who uploaded clips to our community message board. Within 2 hours, the video had spread to every resident in Pine Valley and had been shared on popular social media platforms by outraged viewers across the country. Barbara and Doug attempted to shut down internet access to the community clubhouse, where many residents were gathering to discuss the unfolding scandal, but it was too late. As tensions escalated with Barbara threatening increasingly desperate consequences for anyone who opposed her, we heard sirens approaching. Several police cruisers pulled up, but they weren't local officers. They were state police accompanied by 2 people in suits who identified themselves as FBI agents investigating wire fraud and financial crimes. Barbara's face drained of color as they approached her with serious expressions. The lead agent addressed her formally. "Barbara Thompson, we need to speak with you regarding allegations of embezzlement and misappropriation of funds from the Pine Valley Homeowners Association." While Doug attempted to intimidate the officers by mentioning his former position, they were unimpressed. One agent turned to me. "Mr. Davis, we received your documentation through the district attorney's office. We'll need you to come in tomorrow to provide a formal statement." As the agents led Barbara and Doug to separate vehicles for questioning, residents began applauding. Barbara, ashen-faced but still defiant, shouted over her shoulder, "This isn't over. The HOA bylaws protect board decisions." But looking at her eyes, I could see the first glimmer of fear. She finally understood that her small kingdom was crumbling around her, and no amount of HOA regulations could shield her from the consequences of actual laws. The following weeks brought one revelation after another, as federal investigators dug deeper into Pine Valley HOA's finances. The embezzlement proved even more extensive than Emma's documents had indicated. Nearly $1 million had been siphoned off over 5 years through various schemes. Doug was charged with multiple counts, including impersonating a law enforcement officer, breaking and entering, illegal surveillance, and conspiracy to commit fraud. But Barbara faced even more serious charges: grand theft, wire fraud, falsifying financial records, and using interstate banking systems to conceal stolen funds. I formally filed my lawsuit against both the HOA and Barbara personally, seeking $2 million in damages for property damage, emotional distress, invasion of privacy, and civil rights violations. With the criminal investigation providing irrefutable evidence of malicious intent, my case was extraordinarily strong. News outlets picked up the story, and within days, Pine Valley became the national poster child for HOA abuse. Reporters swarmed the community, interviewing residents about their experiences under Barbara's reign. Inspired by my stand, 17 other homeowners filed their own lawsuits, creating a legal tsunami that overwhelmed the HOA's insurance company. The remaining board members, seeing the writing on the wall, held an emergency session where they unanimously voted to remove Barbara from her position as president. They reached out to William Anderson, inviting him to return as interim president to help stabilize the situation. William accepted on the condition that a complete governance overhaul would follow. Barbara's downfall became even more public when she was escorted from the police station to a waiting squad car. Reporters surrounded her, peppering her with questions about the allegations. Despite being handcuffed, Barbara tried to maintain her composure. "This is all about community standards. I only did what was best for Pine Valley." The cameras captured the moment perfectly, as dozens of residents cheered and applauded outside the police station, while Barbara was placed in the back of the police car. Facing devastating legal expenses and certain defeat, the HOA's insurance company approached me with a settlement offer, $2 million to resolve my claims, along with a binding agreement to completely restructure the HOA governance system. After consulting with James, I accepted with one condition: $1 million would come to me for my damages, while the other $1 million would establish a resident support fund for those who had been victimized by Barbara's regime, but lacked the resources to seek legal remedies themselves. At the first community-wide meeting after the settlement, I was invited to speak. The clubhouse was packed with residents who gave me a standing ovation as I approached the podium. I'm not an enemy of homeowners associations. I began looking out at the faces of my neighbors. I'm only an enemy of those who abuse power. Today I'm proud to announce the creation of the Pine Valley Residents Support Fund, which will help anyone who suffered financial hardship due to the previous administration's abuse. I invited the community to participate in drafting new HOA bylaws and proposed an independent oversight committee. Laws aren't meant to oppress, they're meant to protect, and if HOAs want to survive, they need to learn that lesson. The final chapter of Barbara's story came with her sentencing to 5 years in prison for financial crimes. While Doug received 3 years probation and was barred from any security or law enforcement work, the judge made a point of stating that the harsh sentence reflected not just the financial theft, but the calculated abuse of power that turned a community into a thief. As Barbara was led away from the courtroom, our eyes met briefly. The imperious woman who had terrorized Pine Valley was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the consequences of her actions. I decided to stay in Pine Valley, using part of my settlement to rebuild my cabin better than before, and to fund a new community center for the neighborhood. My friendship with Melissa blossomed into something more. Our shared experience creating a bond that neither of us had expected. William did a remarkable job as interim president, overseeing the transition to a more transparent and democratic HOA structure with term limits, clear financial controls, and a resident-led oversight committee. In my address at the opening of the new Resident Support Fund office, I delivered the line that would eventually be quoted in HOA governance textbooks nationwide. I didn't win because I was a lawyer. I won because I refused to be silent. The quote went viral, resonating with homeowners across the country facing similar struggles with overzealous associations. I began receiving emails and letters from people nationwide, asking for advice on dealing with their own HOA issues, eventually leading me to create a resource website, helping homeowners understand their rights. Today, as I sit on my cabin's porch overlooking Pine Valley Lake, I no longer worry about HOA cops bursting through my door. Sometimes justice requires a stubborn attorney, several dozen security cameras, and the persistence to fight to the end. If you're facing an HOA from hell, remember their power has limits, and truth always prevails. Oh, and if you're wondering what Barbara is doing now, she just received a postcard from me, with the simple message, "My cabin, my rule. If you scream, we'll arrest you for assaulting an officer." The man hissed, pressing a knee into my back as I lay bleeding on my own floor. This was the 7th time the HOA's fake security team had invaded my cabin, but what these power-hungry tyrants didn't realize, I had a secret weapon that would cost them exactly $2 million. They thought they had all the power in Pine Valley, but they picked the wrong retired attorney to terrorize. My revenge would be both legal and devastating. Have you ever dealt with an HOA that crossed the line? Comment below where you're watching from. I'm about to reveal how I transformed these illegal home invasions into the most expensive mistake this arrogant HOA would ever make. It all started 3 years ago when I bought my dream cabin by Pine Valley Lake. After 15 grueling years as a corporate attorney in Chicago, constantly drowning in 60-hour work weeks and stress-induced insomnia, I decided life was too short. At 42, I cashed out my retirement early, sold my downtown condo, and purchased a modest but charming 2-bedroom cabin nestled among pine trees with a breathtaking view of the lake. The property wasn't extravagant, just 1,900 square feet with weathered cedar siding, a stone chimney, and large windows designed to showcase nature's beauty. I'd spent months searching for exactly this kind of retreat, somewhere I could decompress from the high-pressure world of corporate litigation and finally finish the novel I'd been tinkering with for a decade. My doctor had warned me that my blood pressure and constant migraines were serious warning signs, and the move felt less like a lifestyle choice and more like a necessary survival strategy. The first few weeks were paradise. Morning coffees on the deck, while watching eagles swoop across the water, friendly neighbors stopping by with homemade bread and the blessed silence. After years of city sirens and car alarms, I established a peaceful routine. Morning hikes along the lakeshore trail, afternoons reading in an Adirondack chair under the pines, and evenings by the fireplace with a glass of whiskey. My sleep improved dramatically, and for the first time in years, I felt the tension melting from my shoulders. Several neighbors invited me to community barbecues and fishing trips, and I began to feel a connection to this place that I'd never experienced in Chicago's anonymous high-rise living. I thought I'd found my forever sanctuary. I couldn't have been more wrong. My first encounter with Barbara Thompson, the Pine Valley HOA president, was at the monthly homeowners meeting I attended just 2 weeks after moving in. While most residents greeted me warmly, Barbara gave me a cold once-over, her eyes lingering judgmentally on my jeans and casual button-down. She was in her late 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored pantsuit, her silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun. When I introduced myself, her smile never reached her eyes. "We have certain standards here in Pine Valley," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm sure you'll adjust." Something about her tone sent a chill down my spine, but I brushed it off. Everyone has bad days, right? The first violation notice came exactly 7 days later. A formal letter informing me that my cabin's exterior paint shade was not in compliance with community aesthetic guidelines. The notice instructed me to repaint within 2 weeks or face a $250 fine. I was confused as the cabin had been this color for years before I bought it, but I decided it wasn't worth fighting over. I spent the weekend repainting the entire exterior in the approved mountain mist gray from their color palette. It cost over $1,200 in supplies and labor, but I figured it was a one-time expense to keep the peace. 3 days after finishing the paint job, I found another notice on my door. This time my lawn vegetation exceeded the maximum permitted height. I was baffled. I had mowed the lawn not even a week ago. I walked around my property measuring the grass with a ruler. It was nowhere near the 3-in maximum specified in the guidelines. In fact, most areas were barely 2-in tall. When I called the HOA office to inquire about the specific problem areas, the receptionist, whom I later learned was Barbara's niece, informed me that the violation had been thoroughly documented, and that questioning the board's assessment only demonstrates a lack of community spirit. The condescension in her voice matched her aunt's perfectly. That evening, I examined my property inch by inch and discovered a small patch of slightly taller grass behind my woodshed, an area not even visible from any community path or neighboring property. The pettiness was astounding. Nevertheless, I trimmed the area and took date-stamped photos as evidence of compliance. Within a month, they had raided my cabin 3 times with ridiculous pretexts. Weeds, trash bins, and even because I hung a towel on my balcony railing. Each time Doug Wilson's security team showed up, wearing fake badges and presenting documents with no legal validity. Doug, I learned from my neighbors, was the retired local police chief, who now volunteered as the HOA's director of security. And each time I called the real police, they said this was a civil matter and couldn't intervene. During one of these confrontations, Doug smugly informed me, "The HOA has special authority here. Better get used to it." From conversations with my neighbors, I discovered that Barbara had harbored a grudge against the previous owner of my cabin, an elderly gentleman who had frequently opposed her policy changes at meetings. It seemed I had inherited not just his property, but his position on Barbara's personal hit list. By the end of my first month, I'd been fined a total of $750 for violations that either didn't exist, or that Barbara and her cronies had manufactured themselves. When I tried to appeal, the HOA board, entirely composed of Barbara's friends, unanimously denied my request without even allowing me to present evidence. Things took a darker turn when I caught Doug Wilson photographing my cabin at dusk. I had installed a basic security camera after the second violation notice, more out of frustration than genuine concern. Reviewing the footage that evening, I watched in growing anger as Doug methodically documented every inch of my property, occasionally consulting a clipboard and making notes. It wasn't a random inspection, it was surveillance. That night, sleep eluded me as I realized this harassment wouldn't stop on its own. If I wanted peace in my retirement, I would need to fight back. Little did Barbara know, she had picked a fight with exactly the wrong person. The next morning, I checked my security footage again and discovered something that made my blood boil. Just before dawn, Barbara herself had stopped by with Doug. They were moving my trash bin from its correct position by the side of the house to a spot near the driveway. Then they took photos of this violation while laughing together. I had begun to understand that this wasn't about rules. This was a personal vendetta, and when I checked my camera feed that evening, what I saw made my blood boil. Armed with the security footage showing Barbara and Doug deliberately setting me up for violations, I attended the next HOA meeting with a newfound determination. I had burned the video to a DVD and prepared a concise statement about the harassment I'd been experiencing. When the meeting reached new business, I raised my hand to speak. Barbara acknowledged me with a tight smile. "Mr. Davis, I believe you have a concern." I stood up, DVD in hand, and began explaining how I had evidence of HOA officials tampering with my property to create fake violations. Before I could even finish my introduction, Barbara cut me off. "I'm afraid that's not on our approved agenda, Mr. Davis," she said sharply. "If you have complaints, there's a formal process for filing them with the board. We can't have residents disrupting our meetings with unauthorized presentations." When I tried to object, Doug stepped forward from his position near the wall. "Mike, you need to respect the meeting procedures," he said, his hand resting meaningfully on the retired police badge he still wore on his belt. I looked around the room, expecting other homeowners to back me up, but most avoided eye contact. A few seemed sympathetic, but remained silent. I reluctantly sat down, seething with frustration. I observed Barbara throughout the remainder of the meeting, noting how she controlled every aspect of the discussion with practiced efficiency. She had the demeanor of someone accustomed to power, interrupting residents who spoke for more than 30 seconds, dismissing concerns about rising HOA fees with vague references to necessary infrastructure improvements, and lavishing praise on board members who supported her initiatives. At one point, she caught me watching her and held my gaze with a challenging look before turning away with a dismissive flick of her wrist. After the treasurer's report, Barbara announced a proposed 20% increase in security personnel budget which Doug would oversee. The motion passed without discussion. It was clear the monthly meetings were theater. Decisions had already been made behind closed doors. Before adjourning, Barbara spent 10 minutes outlining new aesthetic enhancement initiatives that would require additional special assessments from all homeowners. When an elderly gentleman questioned whether such expenses were necessary during economic uncertainty, Barbara's response was tellingly condescending. If maintaining Pine Valley's prestigious standards is financially challenging for some residents, perhaps this isn't the right community for everyone. The threat hung in the air, causing several people to shift uncomfortably in their seats. No one else dared to raise objections. After that, I made mental notes of who seemed most uncomfortable with Barbara's leadership style, potential allies for what I was beginning to realize would be a protracted battle. After the meeting, a woman in her mid-30s approached me in the parking lot. "Don't take it personally," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "Barad does this to anyone she doesn't like." She introduced herself as Melissa Carter, an architect who had moved to Pine Valley 2 years ago. I made the mistake of questioning her decision to reject my backyard landscaping plan. The next month, I received 5 violation notices. As we talked, Melissa revealed that Barbara had already forced 3 families to sell their homes in the past year through relentless harassment and mounting fines. One was a young couple with a newborn who couldn't afford to keep fighting the fines. The other was an elderly widow who was reduced to tears at a meeting when Barbara publicly humiliated her over improper holiday decorations. Melissa and I continued our conversation at a coffee shop outside Pine Valley's boundaries where she felt safer speaking freely. She described how Barbara had systematically consolidated power after taking over as president, replacing long-standing committee members with her supporters, and changing meeting times to when certain residents couldn't attend. "She's obsessed with maintaining control," Melissa explained. Last winter, she had Doug issue fines to any resident whose driveway wasn't shoveled within 2 hours of snowfall while she was vacationing in Florida. Melissa also revealed that several residents suspected financial improprieties with HOA funds, particularly regarding landscaping contracts that had been awarded to a company owned by Barbara's brother-in-law, but no one dared to investigate. "Everyone's afraid of becoming her next target," Melissa admitted, her voice tinged with resignation and guilt. "We've all been enabling her by staying silent." That evening, I decided to significantly upgrade my security system. I installed additional cameras covering every angle of my property, including 2 hidden ones near the areas where previous violations had been documented. I also set up motion-stringered recording and alerts on my phone. The next day, I received yet another notice, this time demanding I remove my unsightly security cameras as they violated community aesthetic standards. It was signed by Barbara with a handwritten note. "We value our privacy here in Pine Valley." The irony was almost laughable. I checked the HOA regulations carefully and found no specific prohibition against security cameras. In fact, the covenant hadn't been updated in 5 years despite Barbara's frequent references to new guidelines. Later that week, I woke up to find an enormous violation notice plastered across my front door. The garish red lettering announced a $1,000 fine for continuous non-compliance with HOA regulations and warned of additional penalties if not paid within 7 days. I was photographing this monstrosity when Doug's SUV pulled into my driveway. He stepped out wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy day and approached with a swagger that would have been comical if it weren't so infuriating. As I removed the notice from my door, he called out, "That's HOA property," a damaging they turned to face him, keeping my voice steady despite my anger. "This is my property and I have every right to remove anything attached to my front door without permission." Doug stepped closer, his attempt at intimidation transparent. "You know, life could be a lot easier if you just play by the rules like everyone else. Barbara is losing patience and you really don't want to see what happens when the HOA takes more serious measures." The threat hung in the air between us. "Are you threatening me, Doug?" I asked calmly. He shrugged, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Just giving friendly advice. Pine Valley has ways of dealing with problem residents." As he walked back to his vehicle, I called after him, "Give Barbara my regards and tell her my security cameras are working perfectly." After Doug left, I realized I had underestimated the situation. They weren't just trying to collect fines. They wanted me gone. Barbara clearly expected me to follow the path of least resistance like the others before me. Pay the mounting fines until financially and emotionally exhausted, then sell at a loss just to escape the harassment. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I had more money than they had time, and I had just thought of the perfect way to show them exactly who they were messing with. As a corporate attorney, I had specialized in taking down companies that thought they were untouchable. This would be no different, just on a smaller scale. The next morning, I called James Roberts, an old law school friend who specialized in real estate law. After explaining my situation, James' first response was a low whistle, followed by, "Man, these HOA tyrants get worse every year." He confirmed what I already suspected. While homeowners associations have significant enforcement powers, they cannot legally enter a private residence without the owner's permission except in genuine emergencies, threatening multiple property. What they're calling inspection orders have absolutely no legal validity under Colorado state law. James explained, "What you're describing is essentially breaking and entering Mike. And if this Doug character is presenting himself as law enforcement during these raids, that's impersonation of an officer, a felony in most states." Armed with this confirmation, I spent the next few days meticulously studying the HOA covenants, bylaws, and the state laws governing homeowners associations. I discovered numerous discrepancies between Barbara's enforcement actions and what was legally permissible. The HOA had a legal right to issue fines for genuine violations, but not to enter homes, modify property to create violations, or change rules without a proper voting process. I installed additional hidden cameras inside my cabin and began recording all phone calls related to the HOA. If they wanted a war, I would document every battle. Melissa provided another crucial piece of information. Barbara had ousted the previous HOA president William Anderson through a questionable special election held when many seasonal residents were away. William had been well respected in the community for his fair enforcement of rules and transparent management. After losing the presidency, he had moved to a neighboring community, unable to tolerate Barbara's reign. With Melissa's help, I arranged to meet William at a cafe in the next town over. William, a dignified man in his mid-60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, shared how Barbara had systematically targeted board members who opposed her until she had enough allies to call for his removal. She threatened to expose my wife's struggle with depression to the community if I didn't resign, William confided, his voice breaking slightly. When I refused, she manufactured a financial discrepancy in the HOA books and accused me of mismanagement. William had been cleared of any wrongdoing months later, but by then Barbara had already consolidated her power. Before we parted, he provided me with copies of the original HOA documents from before Barbara's modifications. Invaluable evidence of how she had circumvented proper procedures to change regulations. "Be careful, Michael," he warned. "Barbara has the local police in her pocket through Doug, and she's not above using dirty tactics." With James' help, I drafted a formal cease and desist letter demanding that the HOA stop all harassment, fraudulent inspections, and unauthorized property access. The letter detailed every violation of state law and HOA bylaws they had committed with dates, times, and references to my video evidence. I delivered copies to each board member's home and sent the original to Barbara via certified mail. Her response came at 5 o'clock the following morning. I was awakened by thunderous pounding on my front door. Through my bedroom window, I could see Doug's SUV and two other vehicles with Pine Valley security magnets slapped on their doors. Doug and two burly men in pseudo-police uniforms were at my door, flashlights sweeping across my porch. I grabbed my phone, activated the recording function, and answered, wearing my bathrobe. Doug thrust a paper toward me. "Emergency inspection for water leak potentially affecting neighboring properties," he announced officiously. "We need access immediately." I examined the document, a homemade emergency HOA inspection order with Barbara's signature and an impressive-looking but meaningless seal. "This is not a legal document and you know it," I said firmly, holding my phone visibly to ensure they knew I was recording. "I do not consent to this inspection. Please leave my property immediately." Doug's face darkened. "Look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. We have reports of water potentially damaging the community irrigation system." When I stood my ground, Doug nodded to his companions who pushed past me into my home. I continued objecting as they spread out, opening closets and cabinet doors, ostensibly looking for water damage but clearly searching for any potential violations. I called the police, but by the time they arrived 20 minutes later, Doug and his team had completed their inspection and were leaving. The responding officer, a young man who looked barely out of the academy, seemed uncomfortable when I explained the situation. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but this appears to be a civil matter between you and your HOA. If you have concerns about their authority, you should consult an attorney." It was clear he had no intention of taking action against the former police chief. After the officer left, I did a thorough inspection of my own and discovered something chilling. A small camera had been hidden on my living room bookshelf, disguised as a decorative item. They weren't just invading my home, they were attempting to spy on me. The hidden camera was the last straw. They had not only invaded my privacy but had now crossed into illegal surveillance. This was no longer just about harassment. It was about criminal behavior hiding behind the facade of community governance. As I carefully removed the device, preserving it as evidence, I knew it was time to stop playing defense. Barbara Thompson and Doug Wilson were about to learn that they had chosen the wrong target for their petty tyranny. They might know how to intimidate retirees and young families, but they had never faced someone with my resources, experience, and now motivation. It was time to use the ultimate weapon in my arsenal, the law itself. I hired Stanley Bennett, a private investigator recommended by James, to build a complete dossier on Barbara and Doug. Stanley was a former state police detective with a nonsense attitude and impeccable credentials. These small-town power trips are more common than you'd think, he told me as we sat in his cluttered office reviewing my evidence. People get a little authority and suddenly think they're above the law. Usually works too, 'cause most folks don't have the resources to fight back. Over the next 2 weeks, Stanley uncovered a pattern of financial irregularities that exceeded my worst suspicions. Barbara had been diverting HOA funds to pay Doug a monthly special security consultant fee of $3,000, completely unauthorized by the HOA bylaws and undisclosed in the financial statements provided to homeowners. More disturbing was the discovery that Barbara and Doug had a romantic relationship they were hiding from the community, creating a clear conflict of interest. Most damning of all, Stanley found evidence suggesting Barbara had used HOA maintenance funds to renovate her personal vacation condo in Aspen. The paper trail was carefully obscured but unmistakable to someone with Stanley's forensic accounting skills. Stanley's investigation also revealed a disturbing pattern in Barbara's professional history before Pine Valley. She had been forced out of her executive position at Westridge Development Corporation 5 years ago after allegations of financial impropriety, though the company had kept the matter quiet to avoid scandal. They essentially paid her to go away, Stanley explained, showing me redacted severance documents he'd obtained through his contacts. She walked away with a six-figure settlement and a non-disclosure agreement. This explained her obsession with maintaining control over the HOA. It was her way of reclaiming the power and status she'd lost. Stanley also uncovered that Doug had retired from the police force under a cloud of controversy regarding excessive use of force complaints, though these had been sealed as part of his retirement agreement. These two found each other through their shared love of authority and mutual disdain for accountability, Stanley observed dryly. Stanley's most valuable contribution was documenting the consistent pattern of targeted harassment against specific homeowners. He compiled a timeline showing how Barbara systematically identified residents who questioned her authority, then subjected them to escalating violations and fines until they capitulated or moved away. In several cases, properties that had been forced into distress sales were purchased by limited liability companies that Stanley traced back to Barbara's son-in-law, a real estate investor. "It's a sophisticated form of property bullying," Stanley explained. "She drives down values with harassment, then her family benefits from the below-market purchases." This wasn't just petty tyranny. It was a calculated scheme that had been operating successfully for years. While the community remained too intimidated or fractured to recognize the pattern, meanwhile, Melissa and I began quietly networking with other residents who had faced Barbara's wrath. We were careful to meet outside the community, usually at a diner in the neighboring town, to avoid arousing suspicion. I created an anonymous website documenting HOA abuses, complete with redacted testimonials and explanations of homeowners' legal rights. I didn't publish evidence of Barbara's financial misdeeds, yet that card was best held until the right moment. I filed a formal complaint with the County Oversight Office regarding the HOA's violations of privacy laws and impersonation of law enforcement, knowing it would trigger at least a preliminary investigation. As expected, Barbara used her connections to slow-walk the investigation, but she couldn't stop it entirely. Through Melissa, I was introduced to Susan Miller, a local journalist who had been looking into HOA abuses across the county for a feature story. I showed Susan my evidence but asked her to hold off publishing until I had completed my legal strategy. "When this breaks, it needs to be comprehensive," I explained. "Half measures will just give them time to cover their tracks." Susan agreed, recognizing that the full story would be worth the wait. The pressure was building and Barbara could sense it. She called an emergency HOA meeting with only 24 hours notice, barely the minimum required by the bylaws. The agenda included a single vague item, discussion of community standards enforcement. When I arrived with James, the meeting room at the community center was packed. Barbara stood at the podium, flanked by Doug and the other board members, her expression reminiscent of a stern principal addressing troublesome students. She wasted no time getting to the point. It has come to the board's attention that certain residents are actively undermining the community standards that make Pine Valley the prestigious neighborhood it is. Barbara announced, her gaze fixed pointedly on me. Such actions threaten property values for everyone and cannot be tolerated. She then unveiled her nuclear option, a special assessment of $10,000 against my property for continuous and willful violations undermining community cohesion. The board would also place a lien on my cabin if I failed to pay within 30 days. Gasps rippled through the room. Even in Pine Valley, this was unprecedented. James immediately stood up. My client requests to see the legal documentation supporting this extraordinary assessment, including the specific violations, evidence, and the bylaw provision authorizing such a penalty. Barbara's smile never wavered. The board's decision is final and binding under Section 7 of our covenant. If Mr. Davis wishes to appeal, he can submit a written request that the board will consider at our next regular meeting. The arrogance was breathtaking. When James pressed for documentation, Barbara signaled to Doug, who stepped forward menacingly. I think we're done here. The board quickly voted, all in favor of the special assessment. Meeting adjourned. I scanned the room as the vote took place, carefully noting which residents seemed troubled by the proceedings. An elderly couple near the back exchanged worried glances. A middle-aged man in a plaid shirt shook his head slightly. 3 women seated together whispered urgently. These were potential allies. People beginning to recognize that Barbara's regime threatened everyone, not just her current targets. I also noticed something unexpected. One board member, a retired schoolteacher named Ellen Peters, hesitated visibly before raising her hand in favor of the assessment. The momentary pause was revealing. Cracks were forming in Barbara's united front. I made mental notes of each person's reaction, planning to have Melissa reach out to them individually in the coming days. As people filed out, many avoiding eye contact with me, I stood up and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. Mrs. Thompson, I just want you to know that I've recorded this entire meeting and you violated at least 3 state regulations regarding HOA governance. Barbara froze, her smug expression faltering for the first time. You can't record without permission, Doug interjected quickly. I smiled. Actually, Colorado is a one-party consent state for recordings, and the HOA bylaws specifically permit recording of all public meetings. You might want to review the laws you're supposedly enforcing. Barbara's face flushed with anger. Doug, please escort Mr. Davis out, she snapped. If this story made you feel better about your own life choices, our job is done. Give it a like and check out the next BD Stories twist.